So now we've established that the U.S. has committed false flag operations, killing large numbers of people, innocent people, in friendly countries, not enemies, but friends. So America kills its friends when it's convenient, or dictated by policy considerations, reasons of state, as they say. But now, the people who don't want to look at 9/11 will say, well, but the U.S. would never do this kind of thing against its own citizens. And 9/11, obviously that's a case of an attack on their own citizens. So it's still unthinkable. They're backing up, but they're still putting up resistance. So I want to just review some other operations engaged in by the United States that put the lie to that last hope. The first one is Operation Northwoods, and I've got a link in the forum there to a good article on Operation Northwoods. This was a plan produced by the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S. Pentagon in 1962 to figure out how they could come up with a pretext to enable the U.S. to attack Cuba. They wanted to take Cuba back from Castro. And it was signed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it laid out a whole series of possible scenarios that would be adequate to launch the war they wanted to launch. It included a terror campaign in Miami with bombings that would be blamed on Cuban communists, a comparable terror campaign in Washington, D.C., with bombings to blame on the Cubans. They thought, well, we could sink a military vessel in Guantanamo Bay and, create a Remember the Maine incident, and other ideas they had were involved hijackings of airliners or shooting down an airliner with passengers on it. They even had complex ideas around planes with a plane with passengers in it and an exactly identical drone plane with nobody in it, whose paths would cross at some point over the ocean, and through deception they'd be able to claim that the passengers had been killed, and then blame it on Cuba. So, very complex planning. It didn't actually happen, though, because evidently President Kennedy said, well, no, I don't want to do this, and so it was stopped. It may have been a factor in why Kennedy needed to be taken out the following year, that he hadn't gone along with that. The Cuban orientation of the element in the Kennedy assassination is a very big one. But then moving forward to more recent times, later generations, 1993, there was a bombing at the World Trade Center, in which I believe, I'm not sure how many people were killed. I think it was 8 people. I'm not sure. It was in the basement of the WTC. And this was blamed on Islamic fundamentalist terrorists. So, here we have the introduction of the Islamic fundamentalist terrorists carrying out terrorism in the United States. It turned out that this operation was actually facilitated and encouraged by an FBI infiltrator in this cell of Islamists in New York City, and that this infiltrator was responsible for providing all the materials, the know-how, the money, and everything that was required. In other words, it was a case in which a provocateur from the FBI duped these dumb people into participating in this act. So that is essentially a false flag operation. That was a government operation. And then in 1995, the Oklahoma City bombing, where Timothy McVeigh was claimed to have been the lone bomber there and was executed. But there's evidence now that for a long time there's been all kinds of evidence that there were many other bombs going off besides the fertilizer bomb that was in the truck outside, and that he was a patsy. And I've got links there to some good articles in the forum on both these events, the WTC and the OKC bombings. So, it looks like the United States might be interested in false flags on our own soil if necessary. So now I want to shift out of the historical mode and talk about the objectives behind these events, why these things take place. Some of the U.S. provocations were undertaken to start wars or to escalate wars, but others were carried out for domestic or social control purposes. For example, the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, the main effect of that was to pass draconian anti-terror legislation, so that right after the Oklahoma City bombing, it's essentially been possible for the government to designate any U.S. citizen a terrorist, to hold them without charge, to interrogate them. This was the principal effect of the OKC bombing, besides creating the public awareness of the tremendous danger posed by Islamic fundamentalist terrorists. The immediate result was to pass anti-terrorism laws that made it much easier for the state to operate in what had formerly been illegal ways when they could claim terrorism was the reason. And then there's no reason why false flag operations cannot combine both purposes, that is, a pretext both to launch a war and to change the society and achieve additional control over the domestic population. I think Operation Gladio is a really important set of events that we need to look at and analyze because it I think, exposes what are the deepest concerns of the perpetrators of these attacks and why they're carried out. And I've already touched on this a little bit. These attacks in Italy and across Europe were blamed on the left, and specifically the most radical elements of the left, the anti-capitalist segment of the left. And as a result of these attacks in Europe, thousands of radical leftists were arrested. They were held without charge for long periods. They were interrogated. They had been framed, of course, with false evidence. They were prosecuted, convicted, given long prison sentences. And most of them had absolutely nothing to do with any of the attacks. The information, as Daniele Gensero pointed out, the information's come out that these were all carried out by right-wing forces working with the security services under the supervision of the CIA and the Pentagon. So the left framed, but the purpose of these attacks was precisely to blame the left and then crack down on the left. And the reason is that the left, is the principal threat to the established order. Some of the attacks did involve leftist organizations, but they had uniformly been infiltrated by government agents and essentially had been manipulated and duped by infiltrators and provocateurs. So this is a big claim I'm making. It's the kind of thing that I would only make this claim if there were a lot of evidence to support it. And I'm providing there in the forum lots of background reading to back up the claim that I'm making here so quickly on air. So, the target of the attacks, not the people that were killed, the people that were blown up by bombs in the plazas and the railroad stations, gunned down in the supermarket parking lots in Belgium. They were not the principal targets. The principal targets were communists, anarchists, socialists, anti-capitalists of various different stripes who were blamed for the killings. The principal target of a false flag operation is the entity that's blamed, or that entity plus others. And lots of laws were passed to make it easy to go after leftists, especially the radical left. And this is because the radical left always is the greatest threat to capitalist society, because the radical left, expends its energy, works very hard to put an end to the unjust hierarchical social structures of private wealth, extreme wealth, and extreme poverty, state power, and social control through the unavoidable necessity to work, the imposition of work, often meaningless and destructive work that people are forced to do, and make their rulers rich. So, there are people who have been resisting this social setup, which has been around for a long time, and they've been, quite clearly the targets of past false flag attacks. So now what I'd like to do in the last 10 minutes is just fast forward to 9/11 and events immediately preceding 9/11. And here I'm talking about Genoa again, just 2 months before 9/11. In July of 2001, in Genoa, Italy, there was a meeting of the G8, the leaders of the G8 nations. It's the 7 biggest economies plus Russia. And it was an event that was of great concern to what's known as the anti-globalization movement. And 300,000 people from outside of Genoa came to the city and protested in the streets while the leaders of the G8 were meeting there. And this was the biggest of the anti-globalization demonstrations that had been taking place. The first big one was in Seattle in 1999, and then there was a series of them, Prague, Göteborg, wherever the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, or the G8 dared to show their faces, they were met by massive protests in the streets. So this was, we can call this maybe an early phase of the anti-globalization movement. Obviously, resistance radio is involved in the current phase of the anti-globalization movement. Another term that's used is the anti-New World Order movement. The question that I just want to answer briefly is, what is globalization? So that we're clear about what's going on in this movement. Globalization is this attempt by government powers to set up a uniform system all over the world where capital, money essentially, is free to penetrate and buy up whatever it wants. Typically, down through history, individual nations have erected what are called barriers to the penetration of foreign capital, so that assets, corporations, resources within their countries can't just be bought by rich entities outside their nations. Well, globalization is an attempt to eliminate national barriers and set up a global playing field for concentrations of wealth. And the people who have this wealth don't want there to be anything interfering with their ability to buy whatever they want, whenever they want it, immediately. It's electronic. It's at the speed of light. Well, this has had devastating impacts as these laws have been passed and national barriers have broken down. And these agencies like the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank have gotten established. They've greatly increased the rate of exploitation of undeveloped countries around the world. And one of the main emphases in the anti-globalization movement has always been to defend, to the extent possible, to try to defend the people in the global south who are being exploited so terribly by and increasingly by these new globalized flows of capital. So here the anti-globalization movement in Genoa is meeting. It's the biggest meeting yet. And here is the moment when the press hypes the possibility of Islamic fundamentalist terrorists hijacking airliners and crashing them into the buildings, into the Ducal Palace where the heads of state were staying. And at the time that this happened, it looked like the purpose of this hype about Islamic fundamentalist terrorists was simply to ratchet up the security at Genoa so that it would be easy to crack down on the crowd.